welcome to Phantom Eclipse Art, your one-stop shop for originality in comics. Over the past few years, from my own experience and from studying others' work, something I have come across is the fact that you really need to have a method to your madness when you're planning even just a short story. And I say this because when I first started Phantom Eclipse, I was clueless in that regard. If you've seen my other vids, or if you haven't, of course, go check them out. You know that I come from a background in writing fan fiction. And to gently reiterate a problem I had that led me to realize why you need to think out your story in order to make it the best it can be, you need to know the world you want to work in. And even now, when I have an idea for a new series or story, I'll often just start writing, but then I find myself stopping. And it's not that I don't know where I want to go, because I usually have a rough idea of my end game here. But I don't know how to get there without breaking out a pencil and notebook and really figuring things out. In a way, it's very much like going on a journey, and you know your destination, but you don't know how to get there, so you have to ask around a bit, or in this case, create your road from point A to B. So, to break this down, I start up with writing up the initial idea until I hit writer's block, and I can't go any further. I now have a better idea of what my idea is because I have written something down. And the next steps here are going to be harder and more tedious, but they make writing the rest of the story so much easier. In other words, it's necessary legwork that takes a good idea and makes it a great idea. So, first up is usually writing up characters and figuring out the world they live in. And this is where I think writing up loose concepts for your ideas, for your characters, loose ideas for your characters, but don't get too detailed just yet. You want to have a rough idea, but nothing too fleshed out, because when you flesh out to a certain point, then you feel more anchored to that idea, and it makes it hard to be flexible when later you start fleshing out your world. And, of course, next will be the world they're in. And it can be a bit of a misconception some people may have, possibly due to inexperience or what have you, that you literally make everything up as you go. Meaning that you literally do make things up as you go, even the world your story takes place in. And to be honest, you can. And you do, to a certain point. Like if you watch certain anime series, a common thing you will see is, pardon the pause here, a lot of the stories are arc-based. They're story arc-based. Basically, it's like it's a bunch of short story arcs that build up to the big one. And I think that's a very good way to work. But of course that means that they probably had to, very early on, do sort of synopsis of those. So they have an idea of each part in order to get to the final destination. But when you do make it up as you go, and I don't mean like that, I mean literally on the spot, then you risk sacrificing the integrity of your story because you aren't focused, you aren't thinking, and you don't really have a plan besides just getting to the next part of the story. I've done that. I do not recommend it. It is very stressful. And that's because stories are fueled by information. And you can only go so far on so little information. So this is why I insist on sitting down and planning things out. I do it. I recommend that, you do it if you want a story. And as usual, a mark of good writing is being familiar with the fictional world where your characters live. Think about the Inheritance series, for instance, if you're familiar with that. If not, pardon some small spoilers here, although this is pretty early on in the first book. Paolini, clearly had to sit down and he had to write up things about the world his characters were in, locations and ties that the characters had to them. Like, for instance, Sloane. He's not a very savory character in this instance, but I want to use him as a reference here. Early on, we learn his wife died in the spine, and that's why he insists on having nothing to do with it. Well, how will you come up with that bit of backstory? It is a snippet of backstory. It's just a little bit. It's a little one here. But he still had to write up enough about the Spine Forest and Sloane in order to create his disdain for it. You need to know the ties between the characters and locations, and you need to know their thoughts towards those places in order to set up the story and send things into motion. And of course, this is on a larger scale, world-building wise, but there are cases where world building is on a smaller scale. For instance, a series set in modern day or a specific time period, which just relies upon more research versus heavy world building like a series like the Inheritance series relies upon. And another important part of world building is where it results in developing your character's roles in that world. And this is where often themes come into play. Namely, if you have a theme in mind when you set up your world or you set up your characters, because I think that there are many ways to handle this, but I don't want to get into that, otherwise this will be a really long video. This is what gives you the ability to give your characters their own themes, and how they complement or grate against the given core values of the main character or cast. And being able to build your story in a way that can be intriguing for readers to see how things work out. And back to your character roles, I've explained one way to build your character through themes, but another way is through the role they get in that world and how it can affect them. So this is where you can start developing the world past your characters. Ultimately, your characters should fit into the world, and if they don't start out being an impact, which in a way they shouldn't, it should be kind of a ripple effect. We should build towards the characters, affecting. And of course, that applies more to certain genres. I would say a slice of life, it's going to be a smaller ripple there by comparison, but that also depends on what kind of story you're working with. So by figuring out the world and its history that the story is set in, you can give your characters specific roles as a group and work out other details that you can put into play someday. And what I'm describing here is it's a very method-based take on developing a series or a story, but the reason I came to reach essentially the method I'm describing here is because I know very well how I and others write better because we develop the story and everything else that goes into it. It's all these little details that go into making a story, and these things can make and or break a story. This is why I heavily encourage developing your story by alternating between doing short stories and writing up things as you find what you do and don't like. A short story allows you to play with things and then review it later with less commitment than going in for that full-on epic series you've always wanted to do or would like to do someday. I'll end it here. Thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed